So the goals of cross-examination, there's two different goals because you obviously have two different roles. So one, if you're asking the questions, it's to poke holes in your opponent's case. So looking for places that you can point out weaknesses, things that they said that you know are incorrect or you have information to counter. And of course, if you're answering questions, then bringing up new information, working to add more to your case or defend your case. So what you want to ask yourself, do you have information to counter this? Is there a disadvantage to the plan they're proposing? Are they misrepresenting facts, or do you have something to counter it? Or is their logic flawed? So in that case, that is where you would ask a question. So the format of the debate. Just a reminder, pro goes first, 6 to 8 minutes. Con then cross-examines pro for 1 to 2 minutes. Keep in mind, only con will be asking the questions and only pro should be answering them. Then con does their speech and then pro. And just like I said before, cross-examination, in this particular point, only pro would be asking the questions and only con would be answering them. So this is an example of what the debate would look like. Notice right now we have one person speaking. That would be pro. Remember, 6 to 8 minutes for the speech. You saw a second ago her opponent sitting next to her taking notes. So that's what you want to do if you are the person who is not speaking. You want to be taking notes on what your opponent says so that you'll actually be able to come up with some questions. Like I said before, you can pre-prepare some of your questions, but I would really like it if you also came up with questions based on what your opponent said. So once she has finished speaking, this is pro still, remember the cross-examination is going to start. So you'll see in a second, once she finishes, her opponent is going to come up and start cross-examining her. Now, one thing to notice too here is when they do stand up to cross-examine each other, so notice here, Con is coming up, he will cross-examine her. Now, look, they are actually not going to be facing each other. This is a debate formality. He just actually started a timer because he's timing himself. Remember, you only have 2 minutes. That's not a lot of time. So once they finish their cross-examination, pro will sit down and then con will actually start his speech. All right, so now they've finished their cross-examination. So pro will sit down. She's now going to switch roles as far as taking notes, and then con will come up and start his speech. He then also has 6 to 8 minutes to defend his side of the position. So remember, he's arguing against the change. And then once his speech finishes, pro will then get a chance to cross-examine the opponent. So his speech is now wrapping up. Once he finishes, you will see her come up and we'll see cross-examination. Like I said before, when you cross-examine your opponent, you're actually not going to be looking at them. You will stand right by each other. So when your opponent is speaking, you sit down and take notes. And then once you actually come up, you will both be standing for cross-examination and you will face out to the audience. I know this seems really weird, but this is a debate format. This is the tradition. The reason being is because the argument is not about each other. It's not about your opponent. It's about proving to your audience that you have the best argument. And of course, it's not personal, so you don't need to actually look at them. So notice, not looking at each other, facing out to the audience. Once they finish, that would be the end of the debate. Now what you're going to see in a second is an example of a short segment of cross-examination. So the topic is actually going to be about roundabouts are better than traffic lights. This is coming from the Toronto Debate Society, excuse me. The speaker is going to be arguing for roundabouts, so he's going to be finishing his case, and then we'll see someone come up and cross-examine him, and they are arguing for traffic lights. Probably right now you're thinking, what the heck are roundabouts? They are these. So the person who is talking is going to be arguing that these are better than having traditional stoplights, right? The traffic lights that we typically have. So this is the debate example. I'm going to be starting it in a second. I've paused the video right now. The person you're looking at is actually the moderator of the debate. She's going to start by introducing the topic and talking a little bit about what people give points for as far as good cross-examination. And that's what you want to pay attention to. If she says prime minister, she means pro, or the person that's for the government or the change. opposition, of course, means con. So just keep that in mind. Look for what the speakers are doing well and what they could improve on, because there are definitely some flaws in this particular example. And I'll also be putting some tips on, but you do want to pay attention to both what each can improve on for this particular segment. We're going to be watching the tail end of the speaker finishing his speech. It's the last minute, and then we'll see the cross-examination happen. That's the only segment that we'll be watching. Remember, there are 2 cross-examinations that actually do happen in the debate.
8 questions based on that. We're going to preview, we're going to show you an example of this style of debate on the motion. Be it resolved that roundabouts are better than traffic lights. The debate is already in progress. We're going to tune into the closing minute of the Prime Minister's speech.
Okay, so I realize I'm almost out of time, so I'll use my last minute to quickly cover my third and final point. As traffic circles do not require any type of illuminated signals, it will no longer be required to install them at all. This will save money on the cost and installation and repair, as well as the cost of the energy required to continuously illuminate these signals 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Further, these signals are susceptible to damage and power outages caused by storms or any other numbers of problems. Without these signals, we are free for the architecture of a roundabout to regulate itself for free. My honourable colleague will expand upon this and other of my key arguments. In summary, the government's 3 main points are: 1, that roundabouts offer 40% fewer vehicle collisions, 80% fewer injuries, and 90% fewer serious injuries and fatalities. 2, these superior designs are already installed in widespread use in major European cities. And 3, illuminated signals are not required. Please support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. To cross-examine the Prime Minister for 2 minutes, followed by 5 minutes of his own presentation, please welcome the Leader of the Opposition, Jerry.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Prime Minister, I have a few questions for you. Firstly, are you aware that your second point is a logical fallacy?
Well, actually...
Excuse me, wait, let me finish my statement here. As a logical fallacy is defined, you appealed to popularity or the fact that many people do something. In this case, many people use roundabouts. Just because many people use roundabouts, that does not make it a valid point, sir.
That actually seemed to be a bit more of a statement than a question, but I will say that you can call it whatever you like. However, it is the contention of the government that since these superior designs are already in widespread use in many major...
No, stop. As for your third point, you spoke about the cost saved by no longer being required to install traffic signals. Have you considered the immense cost involved in transforming the hundreds of thousands of traffic lights in Canada? How is your cost argument for cost benefits reasonable if you do not consider the refurbishment as part of the costs?
I would remind the Honourable Leader of the Opposition that tonight's resolution states that roundabouts are better than traffic lights, which means that it is not our burden to prove the fact that the implementation of traffic lights would be better. It is an inherent fact that the roundabouts themselves do not need to be powered. Therefore, they are better in this attribute.
Really? Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I somewhat doubt your statements, but we'll get to that later. I shall now rebut some of your arguments, and then I will give you some of my own statements, none of which I have, so I'm not going any further.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So I'd like to point out a couple of points. One is Jerry's long-winded questions. Long-winded questions. So if you consider that you have 2 minutes to ask questions when you're up here, if you can take up 1 minute and 30 in asking questions, that does not give Dave very much time. And in asking the questions, Jerry was actually proving his point. So he did have a couple of questions in one question, which is probably not the best way of doing it. But in his second point, have you considered the immense cost involved in transforming the hundreds of thousands of traffic lights? It puts the seed in the adjudicator's mind and into the mind of the audience is that, oh my goodness, we've got lots of traffic lights in Canada. How much is it going to cost to retrofit? How are roundabouts possibly better than that? Just puts that element of what if, or causes doubt, raises some doubt onto the Prime Minister's argument. So there were long-winded arguments, questions, but he also cut off the Prime Minister. He cut off Dave twice when Dave was trying to answer. So in doing that, that's another strategical tactic that you can use. Because if they're going to start to prove their point and not prove your point, you want to cut them off and move on to the next. It's not always fair, but nothing's fair in love and debating and war. And I do encourage you to give it a shot because it is a fun debating style. Now we can applaud. Thank you.
The next thing you need to consider to be really effective in cross-examination is the secret goal. Basically, what the secret goal is, what do you want to achieve by asking questions? Many times students just kind of haphazardly go into cross-examination without having a clear goal. And without a goal, you don't really have a purpose or a focus. And a lot of times students will get lost in cross-examination. So it's important to have a secret goal. So some examples, right? I want them, by them, of course, I mean your opponent, to admit there's some risk in their idea because it's never been tried before, right? That could be something if you have a solution that's being proposed that hasn't been tried. I want them to admit they have no evidence to prove their second point, or maybe there's weakness in their evidence. I want them to see that their solution will hurt certain groups. So all of these are examples, but these are specific things that you want to achieve. And then what you want to do is create questions that then achieve that goal. So if you have this, you really need to address what are the weaknesses in my opponent's case. You can't only think about the strengths of your case. You need to focus on the weaknesses of the opponent's case. Now, you somewhat did this in the counter-argument and rebuttal by thinking about, well, what would they be attacking me with? This is also kind of trying to do that because you have to challenge what they're saying. So again, you have to think of both sides of the argument. This is going to strengthen not only the case that you make for your speech, but also for cross-examination. So write down your secret goal. This will give you a broad focus, and then what you want to do is have all of your questions relate to this. Now I'm saying write this down as though it's just one thing. Your secret goal could be multiple things, and it may actually come up as you hear your opponent's speech, right? You may hear, oh, that's a weakness. Okay, I really want them to admit, that what they said here was not true, or that, they're not recognizing this part of the argument. So really have something going into the debate, but you can also maybe come up with a few others afterwards. All right, to give you an example, so these two might look familiar because I just showed them a second ago for the format of the debate, but I also actually want to show you their debate with the audio so that you can see what they're doing. So the topic that they're arguing is violent force justifiable to overthrow oppressive regimes or governments, right? So if you have a government that is oppressive, can you, in fact, or should you, use violence to do that? Now, she is going to be the cross-examinator, and she is going to be saying, yes, it is justified. We should use violence. So keep in mind then that the person that she is arguing against is going to be arguing, no, violence is not justified. You can't use it. So her goal is to get him to admit that there are situations where there are, violence that can be considered permissible. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because you're not going to see his speech, but he does try to sort of make a distinction that there are situations where it's considered permissible but not justified. He tries to make a distinction between those two words, and that's really her goal going in. So let's watch what happens and see if she actually does achieve that goal.
Okay, so against the affirmative case, you talk about Florida as an example of political oppression. And you agree that the resolution is a question of on balance, general principles, right?
I understand that you're going to make the argument that this is one example. My argument, however, is that nowhere in the affirmative case do you prove that political oppression always, or on balance, has to be violent.
Okay, but just answer my question, please. So would you say Florida is the norm for political oppression?
No, but I also would say that the political oppression...
So it's not the norm for political oppression?
Can I answer the question?
Sure.
Okay. I would say that the cases of political oppression that you cite in your case are not the norm for political oppression. So likewise, if you're going to reject my example of what political oppression is, we ought to reject yours as well because it's also one-sided.
Okay. Now let's go to the negative case. You talk about the idea that if there's unnecessary suffering involved, that's unjust.
Right.
Okay, but let's say a lifeguard on duty sees a child drowning in the ocean or the pool or wherever the case wherever they may be,
Okay.
and tries to save that child's life. Perhaps the lifeguard fails, but was the attempt to try and save that life unjust?
I don't see how any unnecessary suffering was created there.
Well, I just want to know, would that be unjust?
Trying to help people is a good thing, Tharni.
So that's just.
It's a good thing, yes, it's just, but I don't
Okay.
see why that creates unnecessary suffering.
Okay, and now your criterion is the prevention of unnecessary suffering.
Right.
So necessary suffering then is just.
No, it's permissible. That's the argument I made against the affirmative case, and it's also in the
But
negative
in
case.
your own criterial analysis, which has to have a connection to justice, you talk about unnecessary versus necessity.
Tharni,
So if you're
justice
preventing-
is not a binary. If something is unnecessary, that doesn't make it necessary. It could also be permissible. I spent a lot of time against the affirmative case explaining why that's true.
So then why, if something is unnecessary, is that unjust?
Because it's creating unnecessary suffering.
That was simply a repetition of my question. My question
No, it's
is,
the answer to your question, because
No.
there's never necessary suffering. If it's unnecessary suffering, it's unjust. If it's necessary suffering, it's permissible.
Why?
I explained that we have this general norm that killing is wrong. We never say that killing is justified. We say that killing is permissible in certain situations, which is what you bring up in your case, in
So
terms
we
of
would say
self-defense.
that an act of self-defense is simply permissible, it is not just.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to tell my kids that killing is justified.
So when somebody is assaulted on the street and is protecting their life, they are unjust in doing so.
No, they are committing a permissible act.
Sure, but you're saying that permissibility is different from justice.
But that
And that if
doesn't make
something
it
is
that doesn't make it
permissible,
injustice.
That would be unjust.
That doesn't make it injustice. We can call it ajust.
In terms
Dude,
of-
guys, language is fluid. I can make up whatever.
In terms, okay, so then what are the necessary conditions for justice?
I don't know what the necessary conditions are. My argument is that you're not meeting the condition that if you're creating unnecessary suffering, it's unjustified. I have to negate the resolution.
So, did she achieve her goal? I would argue yes, right? She ultimately got her opponent to admit the whole, when he was trying to make up a word, didn't really work for his case. But notice she kept going. She had a really clear focus and a clear goal, and that's very important to get. Also, in the beginning of the debate, she really didn't get the answer that she wanted when she was talking about Florida, right? She asked about it. He kind of didn't really answer the question. She asked again, and then she moved on. That's also important to keep in mind. You don't want to continue to just keep asking and asking and asking. She definitely had a long line of questions for the second part, but that was because her secret goal here was so important, right? She had to get him to admit that violence can in fact be considered justifiable. There are situations that just saying it's permissible is essentially the same thing as saying it's justifiable. The two words are really alike. So by doing that and having that focus, that really helped her debate and really was what hurt his case. So keep that in mind, that you want to have a cross-examination secret goal, at least one, if not more, so that you have a clear focus and know where you're going when you start asking questions. Questioner do. So if you are cross-examining your opponent, some other things you want to keep in mind. One easy thing to do is you can always clarify your opponent's argument, right? So go back to what was their second point, and once they answer, use a follow-up question, right? Are you for or against reforming welfare? What program are you supporting? Now, this is not always the strongest question to start with. I typically recommend this as kind of an easy question if you find yourself fumbling or you don't have a question to ask. This is just an easy kind of point to start with. You can say, well, you know, what was that one point that you said? And then they can reiterate it, and then you can sort of attack on that particular point. Another kind of easy place to start is evidence, right? So the quality of their evidence, how recent it is, if it's a biased source, so keep that in mind, because I've seen a lot of students when they submitted their sources, they're using particular websites that already have an agenda, so keep in mind you can't have a biased source. So that's an easy place to attack. If I were your opponent, automatically I would say, well, that's a biased source, right? They have a particular agenda. Another thing the questioner can do, ask questions to get your opponents to admit the weaknesses of the case, which is essentially everything that you're doing. But to kind of show you how to do that, once again, this goes back to some earlier advice. You have to have a plan in mind. Sometimes one question is not enough to do that. So let me demonstrate. So let's say you ask the question, your case supports nationwide sex education, right? So this is kind of the first thing I recommended, just basically get them to reiterate. And of course they would say yes. Now you can attack that, right? And your study that shows sex education work comes from one city. So now you're doing the second thing I told you to do. You're attacking their research. Now, they'll respond, yes, and the experts say it will work well in other areas too. So obviously they're kind of qualifying their answers here, which is a great thing to do if you are. You'll notice it says are, that means you're the respondent, aka the person answering the questions. Now, you can come back. Do you think it will work even in areas where there are serious community objections to sex education, right? So you can continue to attack. So sometimes, and this is one thing that I notice students do all the time, is they don't continue to ask questions, right? They leave things hanging when there's still room to attack. So keep that in mind. It's really important that you keep going. If there is a weakness in what your opponent said, ask them another question, right? Follow up on that. So that's especially important in cross-examination. I will be looking for that. And then, of course, the respondent could actually respond, yes, I would probably attack that too, but just keep in mind follow-up is a very, very important aspect of when you're the questioner. So any proof of this? And then our study concluded it would work elsewhere. All right, some other general rules. So first, don't make statements, and I've seen students do this. So keep in mind, right, you're not supposed to say, well, there aren't many accidents, or like we saw in the video, aren't you, your statement was a logical fallacy. And then, of course, the opponent said that's not a question, because it's not. So if you ever run into that, then like I said, you can tag on something by saying, well, how do you respond to that, or what's your reaction to that? But do make sure you are actually asking questions. So instead of saying there aren't many, how many accidents are there? Or, and this is a really good question, given that pit bulls have killed people, so use your research, then ask them to respond to that, right? How can you agree that pit bulls are good? That's a really, really good technique in cross-examination. Some other things. Don't basically focus your issue on yourself. A lot of times students will say, well, didn't I prove this, or didn't we show this? Never, ever, ever, ever focus your questions on yourself. The focus should be on the opponent. So did you show there are only a few homeless people? How many deaths each year do you claim occur? So always focus on the opponent, never on yourself. Some other things. Don't let the respondent, aka the person who's answering the questions, question you back. And this might seem really silly, but I've seen it happen before. So you ask a question about the United States attacking China, and then they answer with a question. Now remember, this is not Jeopardy, so answers should not be questions. And here's the problem with that. Notice, here's what the questioner's saying. Well, I don't know whom. I have to think about that. Do you have another question for me? And they switch roles. Now, they're obviously probably not going to ask, do you have another question for me? But I've seen it time and time again. The respondent will answer with a question, and then the questioner answers it, and then the respondent asks a question, and bam, you've switched roles. So keep that in mind. If a respondent asks you a question, you don't have to answer it, because it is your time to ask questions. All right, answering questions. So now the opposite role. What do you do when you have to be cross-examined by your opponent? There's a couple of tips I have for you. One, and this is probably the big thing that students will always ask me, what if I get asked a question and I have no idea what the answer is? Well, first off, never, ever, ever say you don't know what the answer is, right? That is the worst thing you can say. Here's what you need to do. Come up with some sort of answer or make an intelligent assumption. Now, the first thing you can do, and this will give you a little time, is ask them to restate the question. So they'll restate it, and then that'll hopefully give you some time to think. And then at that point, there's two kind of answers I recommend. I cannot say for certain, but based on my research, I would assume ... right? Or I did not come across that in my research, but based on what I have found ... So essentially, what both of these answers is doing is kind of saying, you don't know for sure, but you are trying to make an intelligent assumption based on the research that you do have. So keep that in mind. Never ever say, I don't know. All right, the respondent. So one thing that you can do that's within your right is you can clarify questions. So I said earlier, respondents shouldn't ask questions. They shouldn't. The only time they can is if they want to clarify something. So if you're asked a question and you have no idea what they mean, Don't be like, what? Huh? What? I don't get that. No. You can say, would you please repeat the question? I don't understand the question. Would you reword the question? Something like that. Any variation on that would be fine. The other thing, qualify your answers. And we talked about this in Tolman's model of argument. Qualify. Never say something in totality because it may not exist that way, and then of course your opponent can attack you on that. So, well, yes, but only if the road is built using the south route, or some variation depending on what your topic is. So those are two things to keep in mind. You can clarify questions and you want to qualify your answers. Okay, retort questions that attack your better by clarifying, resolving the drug trafficking issue. So one thing is kind of from the response you can see this person knew this was going to come up and they already had an idea of how to respond to it. So just like I told the questioner, you want to know what the big weaknesses in your opponent's case are. As the person arguing for the case, you need to know the weaknesses of your own case. You need to have a good idea of what you're going to be attacked on so that you know how to respond to it. So understanding both sides of the debate is tantamount to doing really well in this. Okay. So that is basically for the cross-examination. I'm now going to segue into talking about the outline. So as far as how it's going to work, I've briefly touched on this, but the introduction is going to be the same. So attention getter, thesis, preview, value step, all that sort of stuff, that's still there. The introduction has not changed. What has changed is the body of the speech. And of course, Tolman's is still going to be present. Claim data warrant. Now some students cringe when I say this. The thing is, you don't have to read like claim, da-da-da-da-da, data, da-da-da-da, warrant. No, you can just read it through. Some students will even maybe just focus on reading their data and their warrant. That's perfectly fine. But I do need to see the fully fleshed out argument of claim data warrant. I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like in a second. So just hold tight. Conclusion, that's also the same. Refer back to your thesis, kind of end dramatically. That's really all you need to do. The other thing to keep in mind, so 7 sources, like I mentioned in the beginning, and they must be cited in the outline. This was one thing I noticed in the persuasive speech, that students would have all these sources in the work cited, and I never heard any of them in the outline. And so you have to cite them so I know where your information is coming from, because you could have just as easily come up with all these points in your persuasive speech and then really quickly Googled some sources, put them in the works cited, but they don't have anything to do with what you just said. So keep in mind, if you do not cite them in the outline so that I know this argument is coming from this source, I'm not going to give you credit for having that source. So please, please, please do that. Next thing, transitions between your points. So each claim data warrant is basically going to count as 1 point. You want to transition between those. Another thing, non-factual material. So these speeches, unfortunately, can sometimes get a little bit boring, right? Because they're so factually dense. So it's really important to consider what we talked about in the informative speech of using the non-factual sources of visuals. So if you want to use a PowerPoint, you want to bring in a video, you want to use pictures, you want to pass something out. If you want to use narratives to really add in pathos to this speech, or you want to use examples to clarify what you're talking about, or testimony to use quotes. And then the other thing too, engaging the audience. So you still want to do some of these things that we've done in past speeches. So if you can ask a question or do an activity, involve the audience in any way, that's particularly important. And then of course rhetorical style, if you could add in maybe a metaphor or a nephra or epistrophe, all those things I will be looking for. So here's an example outline. This is actually on the NSA spine on individuals. I'm not going to be emailing you this specific outline. I'm going to be sending you a different one since I know there are a few students doing this topic. But just to kind of go through it because I really like this example. Attention getter. So he's asking you a few different questions. If you turn off your privacy settings, etc., just to kind of get them introduced into the topic. He has a thesis statement. They should be required to obtain a warrant. Value step to connect the audience. Ethos to make him credible. And then a preview of what he'll be talking about. So remember, introduction does not change. Still going to look the same. body. So like I said, claim, data, and then warrant. I don't know why there's a huge space there. So remember, your claim is going to be the argument you're making. Data, and notice this person is quoting their sources, and then warrant is basically rounding it out, and they engaged the audience. They asked a specific question. And then move on to a transition, then same thing, claim, data, they're using testimony here, so a non-factual source, warrant. Moving on, they actually have backing in here. So remember, backing is just additional data if you want to add that in. Not required, but you can. Here's another claim, data. They're referring to the Fourth Amendment here. And then warrants, they actually have 2 data in here. And then the conclusion. So I know I kind of breezed through that. I don't want a lot of people seeing the arguments in case they are doing this. Now, one point on the conclusion, this person actually made their conclusion their rebuttal. Remember, the rebuttal is kind of attacking what the opponent's going to say. So while my opponent may argue, da-da-da-da-da, you can put that in the conclusion. You can put the rebuttal actually wherever you want. If you want to start with a rebuttal, if you want to end with a rebuttal, if you want to put it somewhere in the middle, that's perfectly fine. It doesn't have to be in the conclusion. The conclusion really is just restating your points. And then, of course, your bibliography is here. So that's what the outline is going to look like. Like I said, I'll be emailing you a different copy, but it will be the same format of claim, data, warrant.
Alright, that's it. I know this video is really long. I'm sorry. So here's homework. What is a secret goal? Who starts cross-examination? Name 2 recommendations or examples I had for the questioner, so that portion where I was talking about things that you can or should do. How many sources does the outline have to have? Who won cross-examination in the roundabout debate? That was one of the earlier debates that I showed. And then the last thing is you need to bring in a rough outline. This doesn't have to be printed. You can bring in a digital copy like on a tablet or a laptop. That's fine. But the intro needs to be completed. You have to have 2 points, meaning 2 claims, 2 data, 2 warrant, and at least 3 sources cited in the actual outline. All right, that's it.